All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this recording, we're going to be looking at an overview to the whole Gospel. So in our previous recording, we introduced the Gospel with the backstory and some of the technical details of how the Gospel has come down to us and what it's really aiming at. Here we want to give a little bit more of sort of a map to the content. And to begin that, let me just restate the purpose of the gospel. As we noted in our last recording, John states the purpose for us in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, where he tells us, "Many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these signs have been written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name." That's the aim or the objective John is writing for. He's targeting it towards that. But what I want you to hear in that particular summary is the emphasis on the signs, many other signs. But the ones that are recorded in this book, here's the goal, here's the aim. And that's important when we talk about an overview of the content because, as we noted in our last recording, John presents 7 key signs for us and then structures his gospel around those signs. And so signs like the turning of the water into wine at the wedding in Cana in John chapter 2, or the healing of the official son in John 4, healing the lame man at the pool of Bethesda in John 5. These signs are central both to his purpose as well as to the structure of the gospel. So, how is the Gospel of John arranged or structured? Well, it's essentially organized into 2 big parts with a prologue and an epilogue. You can actually sense that if you just sit down and read through the whole book in 1 or 2 sittings. You'll feel the difference. There's a very clear prologue in 1 through 18, as well as an epilogue in John 21. But in between, you can sense 2 distinct major parts of the book. And a common way of labeling each part, if you read commentaries or scholarly literature, this is very common. They label the parts, those 2 big parts, as the Book of Signs. That's the first 12 chapters. And then the Book of Glory. That's the next handful of chapters about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Now, I understand it's just a labeling convention. It's the way they have felt like labeling. I just see one real problem with labeling them as the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory is that John never states it this way. And when he sets down to describe his gospel, he, as we just read from the purpose statement, he's all about the signs. The entire gospel in John's mind is a book of signs. That's what he says in the purpose statement. These signs are written so that you might believe. And so it seems to me that those common labels are somewhat arbitrary and artificial. So I won't be using them here in my commentary. Nevertheless, the basic structure of prologue, part 1, part 2, epilogue, that seems pretty apparent as you just sit down and read straight through the gospel. So the prologue shows up in 1 through 18. It's sort of like a prelude or an overture to the gospel, inviting us into the story, introducing us to key themes and key ideas. And it does so by really presenting Jesus as the eternal Word of God who was there with God in the beginning and through whom the whole world was created. And the eternal Word then becoming flesh and dwelling among his people like the God coming into the tabernacle now, this time in a living person in the person of Jesus. And so it's like this grand overture that says, come into the story and let's see who this Jesus person really is. So that's the prologue, chapter 1 through 18. Then you get the body of the gospel in those 2 big parts. And those 2 parts show up in chapter 1, verses 19, all the way through chapter 12, verse 50, the whole of chapter 12. And then part 2 shows up in 13:1 through chapter 20, verse 31. So those are the 2 parts of the body of the gospel. And then in chapter 21, you get an epilogue with another post-resurrection scene of Jesus and the disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. That's John in a nutshell. Now, each of those 2 main parts of the body of the gospel, 1:19 through 12:50, 13:1 through 20:31, those are the 2 big parts. Each of them wraps up with a summary statement. So chapter 12, verses 37 through 50, that's a summary statement that wraps up part 1. And it emphasizes that Jesus performed all these signs, and there was a mixed response. A good number of the Jews didn't believe him, but some, even some of the rulers, did believe in him. And then Jesus has a little concluding statement in the last couple verses of part 1, a statement summarizing who he is and that he's offering the opportunity to know God and have eternal life. Then in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, we get a summary statement that wraps up part 2. And it really is the summary statement that's the aim of the whole work. It's the purpose statement we've read a couple times already in this series, where he says that his aim is to help people believe in Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God and have life in his name. Now, how are each of these parts arranged? Well, part 1, chapter 119 through chapter 12, that's part 1. It's arranged around these 7 signs that John gives: the turning of water into wine, the healing of the official son, the healing of the lame man at Bethesda, the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, healing of the blind man, and the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11. Those are the 7 signs. And so the way part 1 works is Jesus, oftentimes in connection with some sort of festival or feast in Jerusalem, performs a miracle, performs a sign. He turns water into wine. And then, many times, then there's some sort of discussion or dialogue about Jesus, about that miracle, about what's going on, that explains or helps us understand the purpose, the significance, what John wants us to see out of that miracle. So you get this sort of flowing narrative. I see it as sort of like this flowing curved line that goes from a sign to discussion into another feast, which leads to another sign, to another long discussion, and into another feast, and then another sign and another long discussion. That's the way part 1 works. And so it's woven together with signs and feasts of the Jews and long discussions with people or Jewish leaders who are wondering what's going on, all of which is aimed at helping us understand who Jesus is and what he's about and how he's actually fulfilling the story of Israel, culminating that story and bringing in the new things, the new wine, the new temple, the new water, the new living water, that he's the true bread, bringing all of these things into reality that the prophets and the poets of the Hebrew Scriptures had promised long before. So that's part 1 around these signs. And then part 2, hard shift in chapter 13, all focuses on Jesus' death and resurrection. By the time we get to chapter 13, it is now the night before his crucifixion. And from chapter 13 all the way through chapter 20, we get this long and gripping narrative of Jesus' arrest and then his trial. And several different versions of that trial before different people, and then the sentence is passed, and then he's escorted out to Golgotha, where he is nailed to the cross and he's executed, and then we get the resurrection account. And so it's one sort of really brilliantly written narrative all about Jesus' betrayal and arrest and trial and execution and resurrection. And in the context of the narrative, Jesus' crucifixion is sort of like his coronation day. It's when he's glorified, and that's what the gospel is aiming at. And that's why sometimes scholars refer to the second half as the book of glory, because this is the day that Jesus is glorified, and it doesn't look like it. It's shameful, and it's humiliating, and it's awful, and it's torturous. But this is how he is redeeming and rescuing the world. And so in Jesus' language, now he says, is your son glorified in prayer to the Father? And so by virtue of his passion, his crucifixion, he's glorified. And then he's vindicated by virtue of resurrection. And John, as we noted, structures all of that to communicate this is the beginning of an 8th day, a new creation. And it flows out of his resurrection. And so the creation account is like a final, culminating 8th sign that begins the new creation into this world. And so John is intentionally structured to help us understand who Jesus is and that now we can have life in his name because by his resurrection, he's defeated sin and death. He's been glorified and crowned with victory, and he's ushered in the very new creation by which God is going to make all things new. And so that is how John has structured his gospel. Now, I know there's a lot of details in there, and maybe it's hard to visualize it all in an audio format. And so I will put a chart with an overview of the gospel so you can have sort of a mental map, a picture map of how the gospel works. But that's the aim, and that's the goal, and that's how John has put together his gospel to help us see that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the Son of God, fully human, fully God, and that by his death and resurrection, he has ushered into this world the beginning of a new creation. And through him, God is now making all things new. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens of folks just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you have been blessed or impacted in some way by this ministry and by the Listener's Commentary, and if you are able, would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? You can do so by going to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page through World Family Mission, my page, where you can set up a one-time or a monthly recurring donation. Thanks a ton for your support.